I won't spend a lot of time on technologies itself, but I wanted to begin with a couple of points. One is to sort of question the thought process of infinite growth and capacity addition. So if you look at the discourse of energy future in the country, it's only about how many gigawatts of energy do we need to add by 2020, 30, 40, 50, etc. So there is a lot of research that has been done, and in fact even Ashish has written about it, that sort of questions the GDP paradigm that we use and how GDP relates to energy generation. The more GDP you need, the more energy generation you need to add. There are also studies that talk about, that relate energy production with HDI, with Human Development Index. And even though the relationship is similar there, for more HDI you need generally larger energy generation, there are some outliers that are often not so focused on. I think the ecological footprint for 2012 or 10 was calculated at 1.74 something hectares per person, and a sustainable HDI that we can achieve for that sort of footprint is 0.55. So if we want to aspire for something like a 0.7 or a 0.8, with the current sort of generation profiles we have, it becomes extremely unsustainable. But there are countries that have achieved higher HDI, that have achieved higher Human Development Index with lesser generation capacity. So I think it's some of those outliers, if we focus on, we might find some good points there. But the other thing is, if you're saying there are also studies that say with the current generation capacity we have, it is possible to meet good human development standards. But what that does require is a redistribution of the way we use energy. I think Ashish refers to this when he says the ecological footprint of the top 1% of the Indians is over 40 times the bottom 17% or so, correct me if I'm wrong. But essentially there is a need to rethink the way energy is distributed across countries, across states within a country, across society within a state. So that is one. And the second, I feel a lot of authors here have written about decentralization and democratization and all of these things, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about why that really makes sense from a clean energy perspective. Whenever we talk about clean energy, be it solar, be it pico, wind, pico, grid, whatever it is, there's always questions of cost. Can the poor really need it, but can they afford it? From the field, our experience is it turns out they can. And the reason is because the value that this kind of decentralized, small, clean energy systems add is very, very different from what an unreliable grid service would provide, right? Even though it might be a small system, people already spend so much on kerosene. If you talk to some of these households, despite the subsidized supply, the additional kerosene that they buy from black market, they already spend about 300, 350 rupees per month on just kerosene, and that only powers maybe one small lamp in a day. Right? And the kind of clean energy systems that we're talking about, people can actually pay about 150, 200 rupees a month, and they can own the system. So the system becomes theirs, their expenditure is lesser than what they would on kerosene, and that is why small clean energy system makes sense. It's not because we have a 40 gigawatt clean energy off-grid target that we need to meet, but because it adds a different kind of value in remote areas. So if we're talking about equitable development and access to resources, the vision has to be one of local generation, because it adds a different kind of value, and people have control over what they produce. And the second is, of course, responsible utilization of energy, right? So with that context, also I think the access to energy as well as its usage varies significantly among different sections of the society. So it's unfair of me to talk about one vision for the entire society. So what I'm going to do is focus on 3 different sections. One would be the rural India, and the other would be urban India. And the third is something that we usually neglect, which is the transient migratory population that we have in our cities, who face a completely different kind of energy problem. So when I talk about rural India, right, traditionally how electricity is looked at is पंचायत और स्कूल को बिजली का लाइन डाला और 10% households को they got electricity and the village is electrified. That is the traditional way in which electrification works. So even though our village electrification rates might be 100%, there are lots and lots of households that still do not have access to electricity. And the way electrification programs work is to look at predominantly at lighting, right, household lighting. And if you look at the root cause of the rural problems that we're talking about huge migration from rural areas to urban areas. There's a lot of rural distress. Part of the reason for that is also because the sort of both farm as well as non-farm, some of the livelihoods that might be there are not being supported by reliable electricity. So the electricity that is there currently, even where it is there, it's extremely unreliable. So the vision for rural India from an energy perspective would really be productive decentralization, right? We can think about all the decentralization we want. For example, I think Uzramaji has written about low energy crafts, low energy intensity industries. If we talk about all of these kinds of different decentralization from a livelihoods perspective, we are assuming that there is electricity, reliable electricity to support those livelihoods, which is not true. A farmer, for example, in Karnataka, wakes up at before going to bed at 10 in the night. He switches on his motor and he goes to sleep. The power arrives sometime for 3 or 4 or 5 hours at night. And he basically irrigates his whole field with flood irrigation, even though it's not necessary. The reason why his field is being irrigated that way is because he cannot go at 1 o'clock in the night when he doesn't know when the power will arrive and go switch on for 2 hours, etc., etc. So in the same way, for example, you can have a sewing machine. Right? A lady might be using a sewing machine in a rural area. By just adding one motor to that sewing machine, it's possible to double the production. So her income will double if you just add a motor. But to run the motor, you need a reliable electricity source, right? And that reliability, clean energy, decentralized technology can provide today. And what that does is further improve productivity. So when I talk about productive decentralization, and we mentioned some of the policy pathways through this, like the integrated district level planning and so on, we're not talking about clean energy as the end goal. Electricity is not the end goal. It is rarely the end goal. The end goal is development. How do you bring people out of poverty through different livelihoods? How do you provide a better environment for a child to study at night? And how does electricity play a part in that, right? So the approach there is different. And often also there is a lot of focus on technology. Which technology is best? Do we use crystalline systems? Do we use lithium-ion systems, etc., etc.? But a lot less attention gets focused on how do you actually deliver these systems to last mile. Like the poorest of the poor in the society, how do you deliver these systems? So something that needs a lot more. So something that needs a lot more focus on is financial innovation. How do you design financial products to make these innovations reach the poor? The second is the first was the rural. The second is the migrant population, which also face their own energy challenges because they don't have land rights within the city. The landlords neglect them and so on. So something that we've tried out from a technology perspective are integrated energy centers, which are basically shared resources. It becomes a shared community space that has also, it can be solar powered and it can have resources that can be used by the community. It can be lighting, mobile charging, and so on and so forth. And just to spend a little bit of time on the urban areas, I think just a few days back in Karnataka, actually, the Sharavati hydropower station got burnt down. They'll take a few months to repair it, and 2 of the thermal plants were shut down because there's no water for cooling. So this sort of brings up the issues we face when we rely heavily on centralized power plants. So something that has to be a focus for cities is self-sufficiency, which is both local generation, which talks about rooftop PV and so on, and I can spend a little time on net metering and other policies that encourage this. And also efficient consumption. Efficiency, one thing is from an equipment point of view, but also from a cultural perspective. How do you inculcate a culture of saving and a culture of efficient use of energy? And one little example is a parallel from a water billing in Maharashtra, where each bill tells you what is the true cost of water. Right? What is the true cost of water? How much is the subsidy that the government is providing, and how much is the little bit that you're actually paying for water? Now, what that does is it sensitizes citizens to get used to a change in price, because they know how much the government is subsidizing. And what this also does is when they know what is the true cost of production, it encourages people to be more responsive in their use. So this is the cultural aspect. So in conclusion, so these were a few pathways to how we can get to some of these visions, but also from a whole ecosystem perspective, there needs to be better design processes where we design products, efficient products, exactly to the customers, and I can spend a little more time later. One example is basically X-ray machines, right? If you go to just take 1 minute. If you go to a public health center in a really rural area, and they have to run a really inefficient X-ray machine that has 25 features that is completely not necessary for that context. How do you then design an X-ray machine that has only 4 features that is relevant to that context, that can run with as little electricity as possible, because resources are really constrained in these areas. So, how do you design and manufacture relevant products, and how do you have a more accepting, governing, and banking structure that helps various technology providers and entrepreneurs to reach out to the market? So that was my attempt at an energy future that is facilitated by a lot of other actors in the society.
Because I think it would be useful to sort of take a slightly longer term perspective. I mean, you're starting from where we are today and saying, for instance, in a remote village when there is very unreliable grid supply, certain clean energy technologies do become viable, right? But can you paint a bigger picture from the point of view, not that these are because otherwise they start looking like band-aid solutions, in the sense, when I don't have access to the grid, then I go for this. And I saw that actually in Uttarakhand. We went to look at Dudatoli example. 20 years ago, or now 30 years ago, when there was no grid supply, the NGO invested a huge amount of effort in PV based lighting, and they started with community lighting, because they were again politically looking at it as a community benefit, etc. And they invested a huge amount. They were successful. They trained electricians, villagers to maintain the batteries and do all kinds of things. Then cost came down a little bit. Individual houses, the better off, started buying the PV units themselves and putting them for their own house. Eventually, a grid came in 10 years ago and wiped out this whole thing. Now those are relics. They're just kind of sitting there with they're not playing any role. So it becomes a stopgap arrangement till the good grid supply comes in. So I'm wondering if you can broaden the canvas and say, well, I mean, a little bit what Asim was saying, if you do the same projection for the energy sector, saying, if we go down business as usual, what are the carbon, the local environmental, the water implications of trying to do that kind of, whatever it is, 3 terawatts, 5 terawatts kind of model. And then make a case for a different future, which is renewable based, clean energy based, and maybe then broaden the definition of clean energy a little bit more, right?
I have a additional, just add-on question, that what are the livelihood generation and expansion potentials if the local generation is seen as the primary choice? See, basically what this does, it means also that the local decentralized solar is seen as the poor man's choice. So as long as that is the case, and after all that's true, the elite doesn't depend on it. How can we make a really attractive case to show that if you were to do large scale decentralized installation, maintenance, and where possible construction also of, because with some exogenous supply of components, maybe a lot of it can be assembled locally. So assembly, installation and maintenance, what kind of livelihood generation does that potentially have? And that would be a huge selling point.
From what you spoke, I understood this whole decentralized system focusing more on domestic energy use, whereas when we talk about industrial energy, it is several times more, and perhaps there are details in your entire paper about this, but energy consumption at various levels of activity, and how are we talking about alternative energy resources to cater to all these various demands?
One thing is that what we are calling as green energy is, at present is not really very green. So if you go to the windmills, if you go to the solar, the whole structure which it uses, you know how it uses, it is coming from the fossils, and so much so that it requires, somebody mentioned before also, that it requires a very large amount of water and very large quantities of fossil fuel in both the cases. So in that sense, what one thinks about ousting this usage of fossils in creating renewable energy out of wind and solar, or for that matter even water. So that is a stumbling block, because until that happens, then how can we call that energy as a green energy as such? Secondly, urban India you are talking about is majority stays in slums and in chawls. What about that? There is a situation you are talking about energy in urban areas. It's a very drastically backward situation in those areas. So whether we are going to talk about that, because these are the villages inside the cities, and crores of people are living in that. And cities, self-reliance of energy about cities, is it possible? Or whether demobilizing cities is necessary?
Just a suggestion, perhaps you have to employ a little bit more fantasy, both technological and social, about one aspect of it, and that's the grid. You didn't talk too much, the grid. You didn't talk, you wrote quite a bit about that in your paper, which I lost to before, but you didn't say too much about it. But I think it's very important not to see decentralization and grid as in any way in opposition. A grid can be a means for decentralized production. The grid is a very positive thing, provided it is a two-way road. And all types of renewable energy infrastructures can be built on grids which are intelligently managed and well built. And we should not move into a discussion, particularly when we look at a more long-term perspective, to say renewable is only off-grid and that's the good one, and grid is somehow a problem. I mean, grid can be an extremely positive instrument for decentralized production.
Bharat, I think, made this point that wind and solar PV, etc., also require maybe to create huge amounts of energy. I would only want to say that, somewhere we have to look a little more, general comments are welcome, but a little more specifically at product cycle costs and see the relative uses of fossil fuel energy, relative efficiencies in these different things. Because just to say that these require huge amounts of energy, I think if you compare with use of fossil fuels over a long-term period, let's say what is the once a windmill is created and installed, how much water and fossil fuel and energy does it cost to create it? So those are really very specific exercises, but my hunch, my intuition or my scientific hunch would be to think that once these are created, these will serve you for a long period as compared to the use of fossil fuels. So when you compare the two, I mean, you will get nothing that is 10 out of 10. But you will, as compared to the use of fossil fuel, it may be 100% better. Maybe you rate fossil fuel as 2 out of 10, and this will be at least 4 out of 10. So you have to also look at relative efficiencies. And the other thing with this whole, I mean, it's a second different comment about this whole thing is, I see that it's a bit unfortunate. It's a general comment on the whole situation on alternatives. Is that things that have even been talked about, discussed years ago, 2 decades ago, 15 years ago, 20. I remember almost 20 years ago, Anil Rajvanshi had a piece in the EPW on decentralized planning, comprehensive planning for energy for the taluka. Now, if really things have to move forward, maybe the government has been slow, but I think even non-government players have not been very good at it. To do those kinds of exercises for a number of, those have not been done. So that is the other point I want to make. That we are very slow in even picking up alternatives that do exist or have been suggested.
You to that. I'll just share one small piece of information in response to what he said. See, there has been specific research done on what we call ROERI, return of energy on energy invested. And for windmills, the ratio is 18 to 1. Photovoltaic is 3 to 1. So it is little low. But the fact remains that the amount of energy that you invest in modern photovoltaics and modern windmills is far less than what ultimately they give out in life cycle.
But for the Vikalp Sangam energy, Vikalp Sangam, we're going to Bihar, and Greenpeace had installed this project somewhere close to where I forget what the name is, and sorry, Hande, right? And so there are there's contradictory information which is available, online. I hadn't really followed it, and so I looked it up, and it seems as if it started as a promising project. It began as an impressive success, and then eventually somewhere down the line it sort of started crumbling. And then there is trenchant criticism of it in some of the sort of corporate media. Scientific American, for instance, just sort of demolishes the entire argument of putting up a solar-based project out in Bihar, and it's I don't know whether it's concocting this, but it says that people then started saying that this is unreliable. As you said that grid energy was unreliable, but they said that solar energy is unreliable, and apparently then Nitish Kumar somehow wangled a power installation there, and that it's running on that, and then solar energy is now a second choice. It's not even an existing choice. And so my question is that how much of this is just sort of a fudged narrative on part of those who have already captured the media, and do you see that? And for instance, as a converse point, the Sharavati breakdown. I have never heard of the Sharavati breakdown. I mean, it's probably recent, but I have not heard of it. So similarly, those breakdowns and those unreliable operations, which are part of the capitalist model, are never talked about or actually, sort of brushed aside or sort of, ignored to the extent that these are mere exceptions. They are actually not the right pictures. So I wonder whether there is some kind of a fudged narrative which we often come across, and whether that's a credible way of looking at it.
I think at some point it comes down to poor analysis, because as it was pointed out, it's absolutely right, it's convenience and there's choice. It doesn't matter where the electrons come from, it can come from solar or wind or the grid or wherever it is. As long as there is electricity, that is what matters. But that being said, I think about 90%, I'll take Selco's example because that's where I'm from. 90% of the systems that have been sold are actually in grid connected areas today. So just because the grid arrives does not necessarily mean a system becomes obsolete, because again it offers a different kind of service. Your lights still function, you still save on your electricity bill, you own that system, and the case becomes especially strong in rural areas, and that was my focus, was because solar, and I'm going to digress a little bit, but solar or any decentralized solutions, it can be biomass, right? It can be biomass, it can be solar, but biomass is not available everywhere. Wherever biomass is available, absolutely it is a good resource to use, but there are lots of places where biomass is not available. So that's why I was being technology agnostic. But you can use small systems as a way to create financial inclusion. Right? In rural areas, people don't really, they cannot take any loans. If they go to a bank, they're not going to give them a loan because they don't have any assets. The little bit of land they have, they don't want to give out as assets. So what we can do using these small systems is position the bank such that the bank provides a loan for these systems. Here we're not even talking about subsidy. There's no subsidy, it's all market price. Right? Once you do that as a loan, two things happen. One, the banker gets confidence in the technology. Right? The banker, once he gives one loan and it gets repaid, he can give 10 other loans because he knows that the technology is foolproof. Second thing, the household would have paid back the loan and they have a credit history. So they can use that credit history and go to a bank and take another loan for something else. So there are other parts of this piece that can be facilitated through small technologies. So you're absolutely right, and I think the PV microgrids going for a toss when the grid comes, that is a matter of poor analysis. Because two things. One, the government I think needs to, and right now is publishing data on in the next 5 years where are they going to expand the grid. So that will give entrepreneurs who are getting into this business a clear idea of, okay, if they have to make their returns in the next 5-7 years, where are the places where the grid is absolutely not going to come because of economic reasons, not because of political reasons. And two, even though the grid comes, there needs to be a policy in place where the microgrid essentially becomes a local generation that the utility then pays for. Because at the end of the day, it's still adding generation to the grid. So there are different ways to experiment with that. With respect to the poor people living in the cities, I think there are different business models right now where people living in the houses don't even have to pay for the systems. It can be a third-party leasing model where all you're doing is just leasing out your roof space and you get paid for the electricity you produce, even though you haven't paid for the system. So there are different models that are not yet popular here, but definitely coming up. And green energy is not really green, it could be light green. It's, like has been discussed, it's a relative advantage. And local solar being seen as a poor man's choice, well, it still offers a livelihood. It could be for the next 2 years, it could be for the next 5 years. And that's the thing, that opportunity cost never gets factored in when you talk about grid extension. It could take the next 5 years, it could take the next government or the government after that, which is 15 years. And the opportunity, and in all those 15 years, people are still living in poverty. So that, or it can be across different parallels of education or health or whatever. So that opportunity cost that is that clean energy systems facilitate even for the next 2 or 3 years is very valuable. I believe I've answered. The one thing that I've missed definitely is industrial efficiency. I think because of the nature of our own work, it sort of I think skewed a lot more towards residential. But Maybe perhaps there is a section I can include. And industrial energy efficiency and industrial renewable energy has been focused on by the government as well as the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. A lot of the programs that they do are based on industrial clusters where they identify different industry segments and focus on efficiency as well as renewable energy generation. The policy incentives are sort of more clearer for industry generation, but there's definitely, I can include that in the
Joy. Your paper also refers number of times to DRE, but I don't know whether you have taken into account the whole cost of storage. Because solar photovoltaic energy cost was earlier days 20 rupees per unit, came down to 16, 14, now it is something like 7. And they say it will come to about 4 rupees in 5 years' time. So cost have really come down from 20 rupees to 4 rupees. But if you want to store it, then the storage cost has probably not come down, and there are environmental hazards of storage also, whether it were lead battery or lithium battery. So all that needs little more discussion. I mean, because if you just if you're talking about if you're putting into the grid, then it's a different issue. But if you want to use it at night, then storage cost has to be taken into account. Currently, storage cost is enormous, 5 rupees per unit. So the total comes to about 10 rupees per unit compared to other sources. So I think that wind similarly.
Just to respond quickly, I think yes, storage, the costs have to come down, but for the small systems that we're talking about, it's still feasible despite storage because the kind of storage is so little bit. But when we talk about grid level storage, yes, absolutely, I think.
But local storage also is a cost.
It is, but even including that, it's still a workable model as compared to what.
No, you can say opportunity cost so much that even in 10 rupees per unit, people will affordable. That's a separate argument.
Yeah.
But the cost is certainly almost 10 rupees per capita at decentralized level. That's what I want to register. Then you can say that okay, people are ready to pay 10 rupees and get into production mode and make money out of it. That's okay. But that's a different argument.